Welcome back, everyone, as we continue to discuss the Great War. We're going back to it because I'm headed to France in 48 hours, and my life is going to be centered around World War I for the next week and then some. Because once I get back, I've got to start editing those videos and getting them up to you. Tomorrow, I'm going to be sharing with you a video in-depth preview of my trip, including a little behind the scenes showing you some of the equipment that I'll be taking with me to be able to bring you the best content possible. So this will be my last reaction video, I think, before I go to France. I may get another one done, but I will be doing some videos from France, some live streaming from France if my connections allow. I will be doing some live streaming from there, so it'll be a lot of fun, and it'll be a good time to do some Q&A, maybe do some private live streams for our patrons and members as well, because we haven't done any of those for a while. But today, I want to go back to our friend Indy Nidell over at the Great War Channel and talk about a subject that I've alluded to here and there, because my wife has a background in psychology as a school counselor, and this is something she and I have talked some about, and we've watched a few videos about this subject, but not this particular video. And this is the Great War special on the psychological scars of World War I. I think if there's ever been a war in all of human history that probably had a greater chance of having a huge psychological long-term impact on the greatest number of people, it was this war. And we'll talk about some of the reasons why. And it's also coming at a time when psychology is really starting to be coming to its own, and there are a lot of great psychologists and great thinkers when it comes to the study and science of the mind happening. So it's kind of a crossroads of this traumatic event combined with people who are starting to understand the effect that the traumatic event can have on the mind and on the body. So we're going to talk a little bit about that today. As always, I welcome your input, and I encourage you at the end of the video to leave a comment about something you learned from today's video, or to add to the discussion of what we already discussed. And please hit that like button if you would. As always, the original content, the link is in the description if you want to check it out without my commentary, or check out some of their other hundreds of amazing videos about the Great War. Let's dive in.
You weren't hit by any bullet or shrapnel. You survived multiple battles, even charges into no man's land and trench raids, and yet you're still a real casualty of war and suffer a variety of terrible physical and mental problems, for you have shell shock. I'm Indy Nidell. Welcome to a Great War special episode on shell shock. In the First World War, it was as early as the first battles, such as the Mons, that military and medical authorities faced what would become a familiar feature of the war. Men with no physical injury showing real medical problems, many of which would persist long after the war.
So if you're familiar with Band of Brothers, you might remember the episode with Albert Blythe. Of course, famously, they get the end of that wrong and say he died in 1947 when he actually died in the 60s. And when I start uploading my videos from Arlington National Cemetery, you'll see I visited Albert Blythe's grave in Arlington National Cemetery. But Albert Blythe at one point goes blind. He has what's sometimes referred to as hysterical blindness, where there's a physical manifestation of something that seemingly only affected the mind. And you can understand why. I mean, when the human body undergoes such incredible stress and trauma, there's a physical manifestation. As a pastor, I refer a lot to, in Scripture, there's a description of Jesus in the garden the night that he's praying right before he gets arrested and he goes to the cross. And it describes how his sweat turned into drops of blood. And that's actually a real scientific phenomenon. I forget the term for it. There's an actual name for it. But basically the stress gets so severe that the capillaries, the little tiny blood vessels near the surface, they burst and they cause blood to kind of come out of the pores. It's a physical manifestation of real emotional and mental stress that you're undergoing. And that actually absolutely happened.
Headaches, cardiac irregularities, blindness, amnesia, depression, anxiety, loss of appetite, nightmares, and many more. By 1915, the symptoms had a name in English: shell shock. But while the name was new, it had been around for a long time, and becoming unhinged during war is as old as war itself. It's mentioned in Gilgamesh and the writings of Herodotus, and it goes under a variety of names throughout history. In the Napoleonic Wars, it was a bullet wind, when soldiers would have reactions to nearly being shot. In the American Civil War, soldier's heart was the name given to persistent cardiac problems. In more recent times, it would be called battle fatigue, Gulf War syndrome, or today, PTSD to a certain extent, although that refers only to psychiatric symptoms and not the unexplained physical symptoms.
And PTSD is not confined merely to war. You can have post-traumatic stress from any traumatic event that happens in your life. Abuse, the death of a loved one. These are all things that can cause PTSD, but that's what we call it today. A very famous case of PTSD is Audie Murphy, who was somebody who struggled with nightmares and slept with a gun under his pillow and things like that. And again, I have nothing but sympathy. I don't know how in the world anybody stood up under the strain of what these guys went through.
What was new in World War I was the scale of it. As many as 80,000 British soldiers suffered, for example, and 100,000 Germans were treated for hysteria in field hospitals.
You also have to remember the scale of the war is bigger than anything before. I mean, we're talking about millions and millions of people on these fronts, and we're talking about millions of casualties. And so, of course, there are going to be huge numbers of people dealing with this.
Shell shock and its treatment would help shape the relatively new fields of neurology and psychology, and would challenge traditional ideas about madness and normality. War syndrome and its possible treatments were first studied systematically in the Russian wars with Turkey in 1887 and Japan in 1904-1905. In the second one, Russian doctors prescribed forward treatment, which meant close to the front lines. The idea being to intervene before the condition became fixed and the men could no longer fight.
And that's actually a common strategy that is used even to this day. And if my wife were sitting here right now, she would tell you what the name of it is. But it's something therapy. I've heard the term before. But it's basically where you actually, in order to overcome that, you confront them with the very thing they're having trouble overcoming. If you're afraid of heights, you put them on an airplane, things like that. Not against their will, obviously, but it's a way of trying to deal with it by confronting it head on.
Doctors compared symptoms they saw to those of survivors of man-made disasters, such as train wrecks, and the symptoms were often the same. There was even a name for them, railway spine. And in the 1860s and 70s, there was a series of court cases in Britain and Germany about compensating victims of railway spine. And the issues of cause and compensation would define the World War I debate about shell shock.
Incidentally, if you're ever wondering why, when you watch video from World War I, why it seems to be not at the right speed, and it's always sped up, and you ever wonder why don't they just slow it down? Well, the way things worked when people ran a camera back then is you didn't just hit the button and go. Somebody was turning the camera to record the images, and however slow or fast they turned it is how fast is the frame rate at which it was going. And sometimes they would be going faster and then maybe slow down, and so even within one recording you could have different speeds, and so it's very difficult to do. And a great example of a place where they actually tried to deal with that is in Peter Jackson's documentary They Shall Not Grow Old, where they colorized but also tried to speed correct some of these recordings, and it's phenomenal, and I highly recommend you watch that if you're interested in the Great War, because it's so great, and it's got a lot of interviews with actual World War I soldiers that are being played while you're watching these clips. Great stuff. But that's why you always see the speed kind of strange back then.
Now, everyone agreed that the symptoms were real, but what were they caused by? Was it actual damage like micro lesions on the brain, or was it purely emotional or psychological? And were sufferers predisposed to it?
And here's the problem: even though they acknowledge it's real, how do you tell the difference between when people have it and people who are just trying to get out of combat? and they start to fake those symptoms. That's an added challenge you're going to have as a combat commander on the field, or even as the medical professionals in the field.
Did they have a weak character or latent epilepsy? Well, whether physical or mental, it was generally agreed that the external cause was the force of modern artillery. Belgian doctor Octave Laurent believed that speeding projectiles caused variations in pressure that affected the inner ear, and initially, the physical cause idea prevailed in general. Part of this was pure practicality. There was a great reluctance to accept the psychological route, since this would lead to an explosion in compensation claims.
So I want to talk about this artillery thing for a second, because I think even for myself, who's studied the Great War for a long time, I don't think for a long time I fully understood artillery. First of all, artillery was far and away the cause of most combat deaths. Artillery killed far more men than bullets ever did. In some battles, it was like 75-80% of all the casualties were from artillery. The other thing is, you have to get out of your mind the typical TV version of artillery, where you see boom, 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 things like that. They described these artillery barrages as drum roll barrages. So what's a drum roll do? That's how fast these shells were coming in. It wasn't boom, boom, boom. It was you're sitting there and it's boom, 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 boom. Imagine yourself in that for 5 minutes, let alone 5 months. And these guys, on top of that, they're living. I think Dan Carlin, I haven't gotten this far in the series yet, because I just started listening to his series on World War I, his podcast series. But I think at one point he describes it as, you want to experience World War I, go dig a hole in your backyard and live in it for months on end. And deal with the rats, and deal with the mud, and deal with the fact that 10 feet away, your best friend's body is decaying and you can't go out and get him. And people are trying to kill you, and, oh yeah, boom, 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 artillery. We talked about that when we looked at the one example on the Canadian front line, and he was doing the whole thing talking about artillery, and they said, I think it was at the Battle of Verdun, where we figured out that the artillery barrage was something like 227 shells per foot of the front. So you can imagine how many shells, and imagine just sitting there, and he's right, there's a physical part of that. The concussion from all of those explosions hitting your body one after the other is going to have a physical impact, but the mental impact, to undergo that for 10 minutes, let alone for months and years.
Slowly but surely, psychological explanations were accepted as well as physical, or instead. But how do you treat something so nebulous? Well, you tried a variety of things. There was disciplinary treatment, such as Faradism, named after Michael Faraday, which was electric shock treatment. There was analytical treatment, the idea that the patient was suffering from internal conflict, and a close relationship with a therapist could help. There were talking cures based on re-experiencing repressed memories. But along with any kind of treatment, there were ethical questions and doubts.
And I just remembered what that's called. Exposure therapy is when you expose them to the thing that they need to overcome. So,
shell shock was pretty easy to fake, and easy enough to get off duty once you faked it. But how do you tell fakers? And what do you do once someone is cured anyhow? Do you send him back to the front lines where the whole thing could just get reignited? It was a big problem, and it was a big international problem. And the medical world was international. Germany was the leader in medicine, for example, while the pioneer figure in neurology was the Frenchman Jean-Martin Charcot. But though the questions and issues were the same all over, there were differences in treatment and interpretation. In Germany, it was Kriegshysterie, and the Kriegszitterer were the trembling veterans who begged on street corners. Now, here's something to keep in mind, right? Back in 1884, Bismarck had passed accident insurance legislation, which compensated for
You just knew that at some point this was going to be affected by how much responsibility the government was going to have. And if the government's going to have responsibility, then they're going to have a say in treatment, they're going to have a say in diagnosis, everything.
medical and nervous effects of industrial accidents. Got it? Okay. Well, what this led to 30 years later was the rejection of psychological causes of shell shock in Germany for clearly stated economic reasons. It would cost the state too much money to compensate people if it was psychological.
So the state's going to send all of these guys to fight, but then the state's not going to treat them for the results of the combat they forced them into in the first place.
In fact, some German psychologists saw it as their job to protect the state from a proliferation of mental invalids and war pension recipients. So Germany set up a system based on containment, preventing men who might be susceptible from returning to the front and giving them work as their psychiatric treatment. These men were treated just like industrial workers. The factories and the shop floors were seen as therapeutic environments and were near treatment centers. Entire villages for the nervously ill were constructed so that, under the direction of nerve doctors, men could take all sorts of jobs. And they were real paid jobs that had value, not just make work. There was no room for sympathy or pity. That was effeminate and pathogenic. There were.
And honestly, though, it's not the worst thing in the world to give these guys something to do that still aids the war effort but doesn't expose them to combat again. I get it. I don't see the problem there.
Of course, more active and bizarre treatments. Faradism, barking military orders at patients, the sudden singing of the national anthem to shock men into regaining their hearing. It was different for the French. The French believed in treatment at the front and intentionally obstructed the easy evacuation of such casualties. Many French doctors believed that shell shock was caused by suggestion, though they recognized that it was unconscious, but they used often brutal methods to bring it out so they could then create the will to overcome it. There was a famous legal case in May 1916 when a French soldier was arrested for assault when he hit his doctor who was trying to apply an electric shock. Apparently, the shock he had already been given was strong enough to move a streetcar, and he would rather be court-martialed than repeat the experience.
Good for him.
This led to the issue of whether injured soldiers had the rights of private citizens or were under military command and thus could be forced to be treated. Italians believed that going home triggered it, that the stress of seeing how women and children struggled with the men away at war sent them over the edge. And psychiatric intervention was geared towards unmasking malingerers. In Russia, they were quite forward-thinking. And in 1916, doctors...
First of all, let's just acknowledge, hey, in Russia, they're forward-thinking. You know, people were always kind of giving Russia this whole, they're a backwater, they're not nearly as technologically advanced as everybody else is, but I don't know what he's about to say, but good for them.
Called for special hospitals and treatment centers. And then the revolution ended all that. In Britain, the psychological explanation was more readily accepted. Interestingly enough, officers were affected percentage-wise more often than enlisted men in the British Army. And some of the numbers are staggering.
So, if I'm just thinking off the top of my head, why would officers be impacted more? More responsibility means more stress, right? When you're a private, you're worried about your buddies on either side of you. If you're an officer, you're worried about all these men, and your decisions impact their lives, impact their deaths sometimes. And so I get it. I get how that's one more layer of stress. Plus, you're still living under the same conditions as everyone else.
During the Battle of the Somme, in some areas, as high as 40% of the casualties were nervous disorders.
Artillery.
And it apparently was contagious in some units. The Army was worried, though, that seeing it as psychological made weakness acceptable.
I want to touch on something he said there. They were worried about it being contagious. Again, if you've ever seen Band of Brothers, they talk about that in the episode in Bastogne, where it's being narrated by Donnie Wahlberg as Carwood Lipton. He talks about how sometimes just pulling a guy back 50 feet from the front lines was enough to help calm him down. And if you had a guy like the guy who was trying to dig a foxhole with his fingers and hadn't even realized his fingernails, he'd already ripped them off. He said he got him out of there because that can be contagious. One guy starts freaking out, pretty soon two guys are freaking out, and pretty soon everybody is. You can't allow that kind of fear to spread among your people.
though treatment changed when it began to be seen as a medical problem and not a disciplinary one. And by mid-1918, there was a whole network of British hospitals dedicated to shell shock. W.H.R. Rivers was a key figure for treatment of shell shock in Britain. He emphasized patients' helplessness and lack of control and saw an interior conflict between their emotion of honest fear and their sense of duty as men, and that three assumptions about personal invulnerability were shattered: the world as meaningful, as comprehensible, and seeing oneself in a positive light. Amazing how differently it was seen from country to country. But long-term and post-war, shell shock created a new understanding that circumstance could cause mental breakdowns, which had nothing to do with moral fiber, and that mental illness was something that could be transient and wasn't necessarily genetic or degenerate. This was the first step towards the idea of psychological causes for mental symptoms being acceptable, made talking cures a part of regular life, and took away some of the stigma of psychotherapy. Indeed, shell shock became a metaphor for the war, a recurring nightmare, images that would not leave, transient madness that struck the entire world.
I've said it several times in this video, I am honestly surprised that any person who spent any time on these front lines lived a normal life afterwards. And I know many of them did not. I'm surprised any of them did. It's a miracle that any of them did. And it should not be looked down upon from any combat in any war of any time in history. And I know many of you watching this right now have experienced combat yourselves. And I hope that if you ever deal with any of this stuff that you are getting the help that you need. And there's nothing at all wrong with that. And not just for combat, but just in general.
This topic could and should be an entire documentary series in itself. Today was just touching the basic points of perception, cause, and treatment during the First World War.
So I'll wrap it up by continuing what I was just talking about, which is, listen, if you are in any situation where you're dealing with issues of mental health, and just as our bodies, other parts of our bodies can get sick. We can get heart disease. We can get liver disease. We can get diseases in our blood or in our skin or in our eyes, our ears, all these sorts of things. Your brain is a part of your body and it can get sick. And there's nothing at all wrong with getting help if you need it. So if you're hearing my voice and that's you and you're struggling and you need to talk to somebody, please do that. Please get the help that you need. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I think it's a sign of great bravery to acknowledge the need for help. It takes a lot of courage to do that. We're dealing with some mental health issues in my own family that I don't talk about and I won't talk about, but I understand. I really do. So thank you, as always, for your support, for watching all these videos. As I mentioned at the beginning, please let me know your comments at the end of this video. What did you learn? What would you like to know more about? What could you add to this conversation? And we'll see you soon from Europe. Thanks for watching.